and welcome to the Conservation Lands Foundation's Community Conversation. I'm Chris Deutschman. I'm the Senior Communications Director and delighted to have each of you here to join our photographic field trip of America's National Conservation Lands. And we're delighted to have our guide, Bob Wick. First, I'll invite anybody who's inclined to add your name and location to the chat window so everybody can say hi to each other. We can see where everyone's from. Welcome. A few words of introduction about Bob. Most of us know him best as the resident photographer, but Bob's main career was as a wilderness specialist with the Bureau of Land Management, where he was part of the team that oversaw the Bureau's wilderness and wilderness study areas that are part of the 36 million acre system of national conservation lands. He picked up photography during his 30 years with the Bureau. And it's more likely than not that any spectacular photo you've seen of the National Conservation Lands are one of his, including my background image, which is of the Carrizo Plains National Monument in California. Bob retired from the BLM last year, but not from photography, thank goodness. And we're excited for him to share his gifts and this virtual field trip today. Before we get started, we also want to take a moment to recognize that as we have conversations like these today, we have the privilege to have these types of conversations and virtual field trips, that we keep in mind the deep connection and history that Indigenous people have had with these lands. And as we deepen our own connection, that we acknowledge our responsibility to uplift and create space for the continuation of Indigenous knowledge and stewardship for these special places. So we're really excited that you could join us today. And with that, Bob, I'll give it to you and take it away.
All right, thanks, Chris. Well, thanks for joining, everyone. Really appreciate it. It'll be a year tomorrow that I retired from the BLM, so it's gone by really quickly. But I'm glad, as you said, that I've been able to keep up with my photography. Why don't we start the slideshow, and we'll just take it from there. All right, so that's the California Coastal National Monument, where I lived in Arcata I moved to the King Range in 1995 and moved from Arcata to Sacramento in 2000. So loved the North Coast of California. And that's what I love about BLM too. These rocks and islands are BLM lands because they were never transferred over to another agency or private ownership. So one of the reasons the BLM has so many unique landscapes is all of the lands, especially west of the original 13 colonies, used to be BLM lands, and those that weren't divvied up to other entities remained in the public domain. And now we know some of these are some of the most special areas in the country. Next slide. Just a little bit about me. You'll see me a lot in photos of the BLM. When I don't have models, when I'm out at 5 in the morning and I can't drag anyone out, I'll actually model myself from behind in a lot of photos. I learned to switch up backpacks after a while because I noticed on the BLM website there were different people with the exact same day pack all the time. And I was like, oh, people are going to figure out that's just me posing. But anyway, I had a love for photography since childhood, but really took it up in earnest in college, and started in BLM in 1988 in Canyon City, Colorado, way back during the film era. And the BLM and other, different entities around the Bureau are always looking for photos for recreation brochures, things like that. So I got a reputation over the years as a good photographer, but it wasn't until about the last third of my career with digital photography, and especially with social media causing an explosion in interest in photography, the Bureau, and my photos getting used quite a bit, that I actually developed an official side gig with the Bureau as the unofficial BLM photographer. So got out usually about 4 to 6 weeks a year. That peaked towards the end of the Obama administration with all the new monument designations. I think one summer I got out about 10 weeks, which was pretty amazing. So yeah, it was a great run. I never ate that well on my road trips because no restaurants were usually open at 5 in the morning. So I'd grab and go at a gas station if I was in a town, and that's my menu there on the lower right. Next photo. So I know most of you, if not all of you, are involved in some way or another with the National Conservation Lands. And I just wanted to spend some time today taking you on a photo tour around the National Conservation Lands. There's over 900 units. I added up, I've been to about half of them, including all the national monuments except Jurassic, all the National Scenic and Historic Trails, NCAs. I've only been to about half of the wilderness areas and WSAs and wild and scenic rivers just because there's so many of them. So I want to talk about each designation and also how they differ. There'll be a little bit of bureaucracy in there, but it's really important to all of you who are advocates for these areas to know how they're different, how the different designations need to be managed, what legal requirements there are for protection of these areas so that you can, hold BLM's feet to the fire in making sure that the agency protects these, and also understand why different areas are managed differently. But I'll also give some photo tips as we're rolling along, and then we're going to have some time at the end if folks have questions on photography or any of the photos. I'd be glad to answer those. Next. As most of you know, all public lands have gotten busier over the years. And one of the reasons, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and when I moved to the West, I knew nothing about the BLM until I took my first job, but I immediately fell in love with our Western public lands, particularly the BLM managed lands, just because they were so remote, so unknown, and really had opportunities to explore areas that few other people explored. This photo from Arches National Park was at a full moonrise, and I expected maybe a dozen other people to be up there, and it was like stadium seating. And this is 20 years ago. So, as all areas have gotten crowded, I just love the fact that there's still areas in the National Conservation Land System where I can spend a day, even a week, without seeing another person. Next. All right, well, let's talk about the various designations starting out. I know we had a full, great presentation last month on the National Monument System. So I'm just going to touch on those a little bit. But as far as national monuments go, they're the only National Conservation Lands designation that the president has authority to designate without congressional approval. And as we know, with Bears Ears and Grand Staircase, that's run into some controversy, especially with the last administration. But it also, when we have Congress at loggerheads and difficult politics, the president really has some pretty broad authority to be able to protect some of these areas. And the protection legislation goes back to the 1906 Antiquities Act, which was set up by, I think it was Teddy Roosevelt, and it was during an era where there was a lot of destruction of cultural resources and pot hunting on the Western landscape, and it gave the president authority to designate areas to protect objects of scientific and cultural significance. So those of you that are involved in new monument designations, everyone's hammering on, we need to identify the objects that are to be protected and where those objects are found, because that makes it a Loctite proposal. There, no one can come in and start, carving out areas if they are part of the objects being protected. And they are supposed to be at the smallest area compatible with protection of those objects. But right out of the door, President Roosevelt designated the Grand Canyon as a national monument, a very large area. So there's a long history of very large units being protected as monuments, and just some of the most fantastic landscapes in the West that are now, lots of them are national parks. Originally, all of the national monuments, or almost all of them, were transferred from either the Forest Service or the BLM to the National Park Service upon designation. But starting with the Grand Staircase, Secretary Babbitt, there's a long story of him talking with the California State Director about not plucking the cherries of conservation areas away from the BLM if he wanted BLM to really, hold the conservation part of its mandate in equal esteem with the other multiple uses. So Babbitt took that to heart, and that was the beginning of allowing the BLM and the Forest Service to retain management of national monuments once they were designated. Next. I spent over a year working at the Carrizo Plain on the National Monument Management Plan down there. And the proclamation for the Carrizo, this is an area off the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. It's the last remaining intact ecosystem of the San Joaquin Valley, has one of the largest assemblages of threatened and endangered species within the state of California. Usually a very dry, desolate place, but every few years when rainfall is adequate, it's just a kaleidoscope of amazing wildflower blooms. But with the national monuments and the BLM and the Forest Service, as long as we're protecting the objects of the monuments, the proclamations are often written to allow a broader array of uses than is typically allowed in, say, national park designated monuments. For instance, historically, managed grazing is allowed to continue, hunting and fishing and other uses. But those uses still need to be managed in a way that protects the objects of the proclamation. It's important for you all as stewards and partners for these areas to remind the BLM, especially with new designations, that there's this additional layer of protection. This isn't the same old grazing management you've always done on the Carrizo Plain. You now have to manage it in a way that protects those objects. So important component for managers. Next. One of my favorite aspects of the Carrizo Plain is just the vastness and the raw geology that's there. This is the line that goes from the lower left corner to the upper right corner, sort of through the center diagonal. This photo is the San Andreas Fault, and that's Wallace Creek that flows across the fault. And you can see it flows down from the Tembler Range, hits the fault, takes a sharp left-hand turn, and then starts flowing again out into the plain. That's offset by movement of the fault. It's one of the most studied areas of the San Andreas Fault, and just an amazing place, not only for scientific study, but for the public to realize the raw power of this landscape with the Pacific Plate shifting hundreds of feet northward over the years, just recent years with the San Andreas Fault. Next. All right, well, let's move on to national conservation areas and similar designations. National conservation areas are the only national conservation land units that don't have any core legislation at the national level that directs their management. There's no national level Antiquities Act or Wilderness Act or Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So that gives Congress, you as constituent groups and other members of the public the opportunity to mold the legislation to the needs of the area. The King Range was actually designated in 1970 before the BLM even had a mandate. And I spent 5 years working in the field there, basically, in the backcountry you're seeing in that photo. 35 miles of just spectacular wilderness coastline, one of the largest stretches in the US, the lower 48, and it's in California, which is amazing. I should mention photo tips too. You'll notice a lot of the photos I take are looking into the sun, and there's always the old adage to keep the sun at your back, behind your shoulder when you're taking photos, and that is the easy way out, so to speak. But you get a lot more dramatic light if you use side lighting or backlighting, where the sun is actually in a different location than just the generic right over your shoulder. And reminder on sunset shots too, it's really easy just to poke your lens up and take a pretty picture of clouds in the sun. but make sure you keep your composition thoughts with sunsets like you would with any other photo, because anybody can snap a shot of a cloud in the sunset, but having a foreground, middle ground, background really makes a tremendous photo. 90%, 95% of my good photos are taken within an hour, either side of sunrise, sunset. That's the way it works with that good light. Next. Red Rocks Canyon is another national conservation area. It was one of the earlier ones as well, and it's probably one area that's different than all the other national conservation land units. It gets more than 2 million visits annually, which would rank it, I think I looked, to be about 15th if it were a national park of the 62 park units regarding visitation. It does have the loop tour to the visitor center, typical of Park Service managed units and monuments. But it has to. It's right next to the Las Vegas Strip and just gets tons and tons of use. But one of the cool things about Red Rocks, part of the area is designated wilderness. That's the Rainbow Mountain Wilderness in the backdrop there, the cliffs themselves. And I spent a night camping up on those cliffs about 3,000 feet above the valley floor, and that lower inset photo is looking out on the Las Vegas Strip from in that wilderness. I could turn 180 degrees and not see any sign of human habitation from that lower inset photo. Just an incredible place to have right next to Las Vegas, and that's yeah, it's just a national treasure. So again, Red Rocks in Las Vegas. Next slide. This is the Alabama Hills. There are other areas that we lump in with the national conservation areas that have their own unique designation that don't have any national, broad legislation backing them. They're again made to order for the needs of the local communities. There's areas like Steens Mountain Cooperative Protection and Management Area in Oregon. They did not want that to be a national monument or conservation area. Same thing with Alabama Hills National Scenic Area here in California. Next slide. And the Alabama Hills, I always like looking at movie scenes to try to see where they are, especially when they're in the West. But if you look at a lot of old Western movies, you'll see these rocks. And they're indicative of the Alabama Hills with the backdrop of the Sierra behind them. The town of Lone Pine is very dependent on tourism and the filming that goes on in the area. Films like Iron Man, Django Unchained, Gladiator, and then you go back to old John Wayne Westerns. They've been filmed there forever, and they again did not want to be a national monument or conservation area. They wanted their legislation to be very clear that filming would be an integral part of management of that area going into the future. So that's another one of those unique designations. Next slide. Yep. Now we move on to wild and scenic rivers, and this is an interesting photo because this is the John C. Boyle power plant on the Klamath River. The entire Klamath River at low flows is diverted through those two penstocks, and that's actually a dam that's one of the Klamath dams that's going to be removed in the next couple years. And as Chris said, the tribes have played integral roles in these areas and have a long history with them, and the Yurok and Karuk tribe have been very integral to negotiating the removal of these dams along the Klamath. But the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was passed in 1968 during an era where we had massive numbers of large dams and water diversions being developed, starting from Hetch Hetchy in Yosemite National Park to Lake Powell, Flaming Gorge. I mean, you just name hundreds of different dams. And there was an agreement and a push in the conservation community that we need to retain some segments of rivers in their free-flowing condition where they'd be undammed, undiverted, and remain wild by nature. And they realized that even national parks couldn't provide that level of protection. There were dams proposed for Dinosaur National Monument, Echo Park. There was a dam proposed in the Grand Canyon, and of course Hetch Hetchy. So they wanted something specific to protect free-flowing, outstanding rivers. So that was when the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was passed, and some amazing rivers on BLM lands were protected or are protected through that act. Next slide, excuse me. The Klamath has outstanding whitewater, amazing salmon fishery downstream that will only get better as these dams are removed, and very important both to commercial. It was one of the largest salmon runs on the West Coast at one point, and I think it still is, but definite water quality improvements with those dam removals. Next. So one of the cool things that I always used to talk about, I worked at the first National Conservation Lands designation in the BLM, 1970 in the King Range, but then I realized later that's not the case. There were 8 rivers designated under the original Wild and Scenic Rivers Act in 1968, and one of them was the Rio Grande here in northern New Mexico. And this is a shot of the canyon of the Rio Grande looking up north towards Colorado. Very amazing bird of prey nesting area on those cliff areas further downstream. It's great whitewater rafting. The one thing that National Wild and Scenic Rivers do is they only protect a 1/4 mile on either side of the river. Hold on a second. My screen just locked up. So with the Rio Grande, now that it's a national monument, that protects a much larger landscape, including as well as surrounding that Wild and Scenic Rivers corridor. So it very much complements that original Wild and Scenic River designation. Next photo. I was going to say, and I blew my quiz, but what was the other of the original 8 rivers designated that was on BLM lands? And that's the Rogue Wild and Scenic River in Oregon, which is, again, an amazing salmon fishery, beautiful canyon stream in the Oregon Coast Range. Zane Grey, whose cabin is on BLM lands in the Wild and Scenic Corridor now, it's been acquired and preserved, was a well-known Western author, and he wrote often about the Rogue and fished it all the time. And his popularity as an author and writing about the rivers started bringing throngs of fishermen to the Rogue. So he finally got to the point where he went to the Umpqua River to fish because the Rogue was overcrowded. So he was sort of the first Instagram influencer that sent a natural place through the stratosphere as far as use levels, and a good example of over promoting an area, or be careful on how you promote an area. But the Rogue, one of the neat things is you can float the river in a wilderness setting and stay in these amazing fishing lodges on the way down and kind of have a pampered trip, which is really cool. Next. Just a couple other Wild and Scenic River shots. This is Beaver Creek in Alaska. I've been fortunate enough to be there both in winter and summer. When I was there in the winter, it was about 20 below, and we set this tent up as a prop. I slept in a little trail cabin that was about 80 degrees right behind where I took this photo because it was about 20 below when I took it. But yeah, the rivers in Alaska especially are used in the winter as much as for travel corridors as they are in the summer. When I was on Beaver Creek in the summer, we got stranded there for about 3 days. We were brought in by helicopter, and the river went up and the deck ceiling came down, and the guy I was with was saying, well, we have a choice of waiting this out or floating 350 miles down to the Alaska Pipeline Bridge, which was the next nearest point we could find civilization. So Alaska is just at a totally different level of scale of anything that I've ever seen in my life. Next. And again, talking about the cultural significance, this is the Deschutes Wild and Scenic River in Oregon. Shearers Falls is used extensively by the Warm Springs Federation of Tribes for traditional salmon fishing. Same thing goes on the Klamath and many other rivers in the West. So very important to tribal history and culture and sustenance. Next slide. And of course, any river-related species, the Act calls for protection of outstandingly remarkable values tied to the river, and that can be cultural, recreation, wildlife. This is the Upper Missouri River Breaks, which has some incredible big game and wildlife species in the canyons. These are some bighorn sheep. And a tip for wildlife photos is always focus on the eyes of whatever animal you're photographing. The rest of it can be out of focus, but as long as you get a eye in focus or both eyes, you'll have a good photo. Next. And just as a reminder that not all wild and scenic rivers are these big, floatable, rapid-filled rivers. This is the Amargosa River, which actually drains into Death Valley in wet winters. The river's saltier than the ocean. It flows subsurface for most of its length, but for a portion of its length over near Shoshone and Tacoma, California, it flows along the surface. Desert pupfish, important species in this lake. It's also probably the rarest mammal species in the world, lives in these patches of rushes along the lake, the Amargosa vole. They actually have a captive breeding program at the University of California, Davis, because there's so few animals in such a small area of habitat. They're afraid of extinction, but just an amazing river corridor. Next. All right, well, let's move on to National Scenic and Historic Trails. The National Scenic Trails Act was passed on the same day as President Johnson signed it as the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and it designated two original scenic trails, the Appalachian and the Pacific Crest including stretches on BLM lands. The National Historic Trails were added later. And this is one of the most famous trails of the National Historic Trails, the Pony Express. Those of you who are able to get to Wyoming, the South Pass area is really amazing. It was a point where all westward migration in the 1800s went over South Pass because it was a low point in the Rockies. And so the Mormon Immigrant Trail, California Trail, Oregon Trail, as well as the Pony Express Trail all converged in this area. This is actually a good example of a silhouette photo too, those of you who are interested in photography. With silhouettes, they're fun photos. Just make sure you're shooting towards the sun, and so it's going to be backlit, and that your subject, in this case the person on the horse, is backlit by the sky, and then just expose the photo for the sky and the landscape, and you get a neat silhouette of someone. Next slide. And this is just a map showing the historic and scenic trails now, longer than the interstate highway system. The historic trails are a little different in that most of them don't have trail treads anymore. The Oregon Trail, California Trail, there's remnants of some of them, and there's old stage stops along the Pony Express, but they have auto tour and recreational tour corridors that go generally along the routes, but they don't have a tread like the Pacific Crest Trail would. But with historic trails, they're important to the history and the settlement of our country, and the BLM manages more miles of public land than any other agency that has national historic trails going through it. Next. And just a photo of the Continental Divide Trail through New Mexico. BLM has some great mileage along that trail section through New Mexico, Wyoming, a little bit in Colorado, some in Montana. Next. And we often think of through hikers like Reese Witherspoon in the Wild movie on using these trails for long distance backpacks, but the National Scenic Trails are also backyard spots. This is right in the Palm Springs area. You can be out on this trail in 15 minutes, and there's lots of day hikers out there. So wonderful series of connecting trails that tie into these, so that they're not just for gonzo backpackers to use. Photo tip for kids: if you ever want kids to smile, just get them to run. That's the best thing I've always found with photos. They can't not laugh if you if you get them running, especially in a group. So I've had a lot of fun having kids run and getting photos. Couple trips too, but they bounce right back up. Next. And just a couple shots of National Historic Trails. This is Lemhi Pass, which is on BLM land up above Salmon, Idaho. This is where Sacagawea escorted the Lewis and Clark expedition over the pass into the Western Territories. Very beautiful area, especially in the spring, wide open Rocky Mountains. Next slide. And this is a particularly sad spot to me. This is in the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument along Cow Creek, which is it flows off to the right. It will flow down into the Upper Missouri River. So the Lewis and Clark expedition, I believe, went through here in 1804. And then in, I believe it was 1877. So something like 72, 73 years later, the Nez Perce tribe was chased through the same river corridor, crossed the river at Cow Creek, raided some boats just because they were desperate for food, and then they rested up in Cow Creek just north of the river, and they were caught by the cavalry right before they crossed into Canada. So just a very sad story of, within 70 years, the triumph of European settlement in the West, and the just crushing of the tribes in such a short period. It's truly something to contemplate. Next slide. And this is the Black Rock Desert, which is, again, it's a national conservation area that was designated to protect these vast landscapes that were part of the California Trail corridor. Black Rock itself is, Black Rock Point is that point, the black rock at the point in the middle of the playa there. In the upper part of the photo, Burning Man, which I'll show a slide of in a minute, is normally held just off to the right of Black Rock Point. Pretty neat area in that it's a major area for model rocketry. They actually have a closure up to 200,000 feet, vertical air closure the FAA puts into place, so that allows for model rocket. I mean, we're talking big model rocket launches, 20 feet high. It's also the site of the world land speed record. I think that was in the 1990s. It was like 760 miles an hour by a British driver. So pretty amazing array of uses that the BLM is charged to manage for in the NCA legislation, while also giving priority to protecting this landscape that was such a significant part of American history. There's actually some hot springs over by the Black Rock, and this was such a desolate, difficult part of the trail that the oxen that were leading the wagons through the playa saw water in these hot springs and dove into them and were basically cooked to death. So there were oxen bones all along the trail through here before they made it to California. Next slide. And there are some amazing remnants along these trails too, or old graffiti of settlers that were just very excited that they were making it across to the west. There's areas in Wyoming, I think 4th of July rock, and some others that are covered with different inscriptions of travelers that made it west. It was pretty amazing. Donner Party aside, most of the settlers that made this arduous migration westward survived. There was a very low mortality rate. It was pretty amazing what they went through. Next. And of course, this is a shot of Burning Man, which goes to show the challenges that go into managing some of these areas. Burning Man is, it's controversial. Not everyone supports it, but it's written into the legislation for the Black Rock that the BLM will manage to allow for events like this. There's discussion about what size is appropriate, but the cool thing is, at least on the playa itself, there is a really big leave no trace ethic among the burners, and they really work hard. The organization works hard to have no impacts on the playa once they leave. As far as trash, you have to collect all your gray water. There's no fires allowed on the playa, anything like that. Even the burns themselves, they burn structures and things. They have to put a layer of gravel down so that it won't scorch the playa, and then they take that up afterwards. So anyway, pretty amazing event art-wise. Next. And the Iditarod, and gosh, I'm forgetting this guy's name. He's the winner of this year's Iditarod. Brett, I think these guys are like NFL players up in Alaska. This was the 2019. I was able to photograph the Iditarod, and there's some trail cabins along the route that I didn't realize it, but the mushers sleep in those. They'll put their dogs down to sleep. Those dogs are amazing. They'll eat, sleep, and just jump up and run in a matter of, minutes, going from each one to the next. It's pretty amazing. So it's kind of fun to get to hang out with some of these folks. And there is a lot of controversy around the Iditarod as far as whether it's ethical to treat dogs that way. But I do know all the mushers I met in Alaska, whether they were involved in the Iditarod or not, they live for those dogs. They're, family. It's pretty amazing how they care for them, and it's just their focus in life. Next. And this is actually a 3-fer or maybe a 4-fer. This is Soda Mountains Wilderness. So we'll talk about wilderness now, which is in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument in Oregon. This is me standing along the Pacific Crest Trail, National Scenic Trail, and I'm looking at Pilot Rock, which was a major point along the I think it was the Applegate or the Lassen branch of the California Trail. So all these various designations overlap in this area. One of the cool things about places like Pilot Rock and Black Rock is in Nevada and numerous others, they were used by trappers and explorers back early on as points to find their way, navigate around, but then they became landmarks for settlers as they were working their way west. They knew if they got to 4th of July Rock in Wyoming by 4th of July, they were on time. They knew when they got to Pilot Rock, they had reached Oregon and California. So pretty cool. The thing about Wilderness Act was passed in 1964 after a long effort. It started administratively with particularly the Forest Service administratively protecting certain areas. But the proponents of the Wilderness Act realized that they needed to do more and have a congressional protection that would be permanent for these areas. And wilderness, unlike national monuments, national conservation areas, other designations, they have no development in them. There are some trails, but there are no structures. There's no commercial activity allowed with very limited exceptions to that. So they're really areas that are to be kept in their primeval state. So it makes sense that parts of areas like Cascade-Siskiyou will have campgrounds, roads, even OHV trails. But when you get into wilderness, you're going to be on foot or on horseback, and there's going to be no development. So it's pretty much the most protective of the various designations. Next. This is one of our newer wilderness areas, Mexican Mountain in Utah. I just can't really pick a favorite spot in the National Conservation Lands, but there's a lot that can't be beat, and this Red Rock country in Utah is just amazing. And the neat thing about Utah is you don't have to be in a national park like, Yosemite. There's no other Yosemite in California, but in Utah, there are so many amazing canyons and areas like this that are on BLM lands that are equally spectacular to the Capitol Reefs and some of the other parks in Utah. So, and you can be off on your own in them. This is in this San Rafael Swell area. Next. One important thing about BLM lands in general, and all backcountry wilderness lands are natural landscapes, but especially in these remote areas, is visitors need to really be prepared and to know what they're getting into. This is a Wild Horse Canyon, which is one of the most popular slot canyons in Utah. These are some shots of me hiking through the canyon. The one on the top left, you can see the brown stain on that rock. At first I thought, oh, that's interesting how the rock color is changing so quickly. Then I realized it was sediment from a flash flood earlier that week. And if you move down to the bottom right photo, it's hard to see, but the lighter colored rock is probably 20 or 30 feet up the side of the canyon. That's how deep the water was rushing through that canyon. And there have been numerous people killed in this canyon. A couple little girls just 2 summers ago, just because they go in during a period of thunderstorms, and the thunderstorm may hit 5-10 miles away and just cause a wall of water that traps them in. And so really important to educate people about the specific safety and preparation needs when they enter these remote areas. Next. All right, well, just a nice picture of Jerry Peak Wilderness during the eclipse. Definitely, if you get a chance to see the next eclipse, I think it's in the Midwest, don't settle for 95%. You got to see the 100% eclipse. There's nothing more amazing. Next. All right, last but not least on the designations are wilderness study areas, which a lot of our national monuments, Bears Ears, Grand Staircase, some of the core parts of those areas were identified as wilderness study areas by the BLM back in the late 1970s, and there's still wilderness study areas. And people are always like, why is BLM still studying these? Well, we did our study at the direction of Congress in our Federal Land Policy and Management Act in 1976. We presented our recommendations to the President and Congress in 1992, and there was an expectation that Congress would run with these and then make decisions whether to designate them as wilderness or release them back into general BLM management. So you always hear things about WSA and wilderness language about whether or not these areas should be released. And a lot of times, if someone is, some of these studies back at the time were very conservative and recommended only a small number of the units be designated. BLM sort of had alpine envy then. They thought anything that was, desert-like or not like this photo was not worthy of wilderness designation. So a lot of areas that are now designated as wilderness were not recommended by the BLM. And the BLM and the Department of Interior have gone on record saying that those 1992 recommendations were snapshot in time. Unless Congress directs us, we're not going to study the areas again, but we feel it's important to look at each area based on present circumstances and present public opinion in new legislation, and not step back 30 years and use those original recommendations. So wilderness study areas are an interim designation. And so it's important that we get some kind of permanent protection for these areas. And they also have some policy backing and guidance in them that was really meant to be in place for just a few years, that's now been in place for 30 years. Like motor vehicles are allowed on 2-track routes through these areas. So there's a lot of management issues that come up in these areas that make them somewhat difficult to manage. But they're just as spectacular as any other of the units. Next. Just a couple pictures of some other WSAs. This shows different kind of lightings for photographs, front lighting and back lighting, just getting different perspectives. Next photo. I know I'm getting low on time here, so I'm just going to skip through these. This is a night sky photo with the moon, which is kind of cool. You can use the moon just like the sun if you get your camera on a tripod. So definitely, if you're into night sky photos, Milky Way, the moon are all fun to photograph. Next. This is what the wildlife in Wyoming think about the lack of new designations in Wyoming these days. And just kidding, I just like the fact that these guys have black tongues, but Wyoming doesn't have that many national conservation land designations, except for our interim wilderness study areas and a large cross section of national historic trails. Pretty amazing collection of those. Next. And this is just a picture of how beautiful some of the WSAs are in Wyoming. Next slide. All right, well, now ending up, let's just look at a few shots of some campaigns that are going on around the West with the Conservation Lands Foundation. I just have a few photos of those, but wanted to share them. This is the Dolores River Wilderness Study Area in Colorado, which makes up the lower Dolores, and this is part of, I believe, a national monument proposal right now. And again, just an example of what's a wilderness study area. Probably will be very difficult in the current situation with Congress to get this designated as wilderness. There have been wilderness proposals on BLM lands in Colorado for decades that haven't moved, but the president has authority to designate this as a national monument if that campaign is successful, which would be pretty cool. Next slide. And this is just the upper Dolores moving more towards Cortez, just showing the difference. It's a much deeper canyon, much more precipitation there. So very different character. Next slide. I only have one slide of the Gila River in Arizona, the Great Gila River Bend, I believe it's called. And this is the Painted Rock, which is a very improper name for a petroglyph site instead of a pictograph. But this is just an amazing petroglyph area. The petroglyph on the right, that fuzzy picture I pulled off of YouTube, it's one of the solstice rocks that they use to determine times a year, but you can see that sun dagger that's on the solstice pointing right at the sun. It's pretty amazing, just at a certain time during the winter solstice. And then just a photo I took on the bottom in mid-January. It just shows, there's no specific area the sun's shining on then. So pretty amazing area. I want to explore it more. Next. And lastly, the most vast area that any agency manages in the federal government, this is the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska, otherwise known as the Western Arctic. The National Petroleum Reserve is a misnomer of a name because the legislation equally gives value to the importance of this area for Native Alaskan subsistence. But currently, the area is almost completely undeveloped, and it's just beyond words how vast it is. This is by Teshepuk Lake. Next slide. And I was lucky enough to get up there in the winter as well, or in March, and it's just white, vast whiteness. I mean, they were plugging some wells that the USGS had put in back in the 50s, and we got to photograph some of the effort they were doing to reclaim those well pads, but we landed on an ice runway, and I mean, it was just pretty amazing to be 200 or 300 miles from the nearest development. Next. And again, the importance of the area for subsistence for Native Alaskans. That gentleman in the green jacket in the back is at the time, I don't know if he's still working for BLM, but he was our northernmost employee living in Utqiagvik, which used to be known as Barrow. But they're stretching seal skins on a whaling boat here, and they will go out in that boat for whaling each summer. And according to that gentleman, about 75% of their diet is subsistence. They go to the store to get flour or some odd and end things to add to what they catch or hunt or otherwise collect subsistence wise. So it's extremely, and the NPRA or Western Arctic is extremely important to their lives. Next slide. And just a couple wildlife photos. Again, the massive caribou herds. There's a ptarmigan. I always feel bad for ptarmigans when they're switching colors. It's like they're standing out in the tundra because their white feathers aren't gone. But anyway, the one cool thing I found out about birds, like that loon on the right, and I don't have a photo of the actual migrating birds that come into that area from other parts of the world, but I always thought, we'll have US birds flying up there, but no, they come from Asia. I think some come from Europe. Birds migrate up there from all over the Northern Hemisphere. It's pretty incredible. Next slide. And one of the sad things about the Arctic, I was expecting beaches along the Arctic Ocean, but it's actually permafrost going right to the edge of the sea. And when I was in Alaska, I did not, maybe I was in a self-selecting group, but people weren't questioning climate change. They were seeing the permafrost melting. They were, witnessing it firsthand. What to do about it, everyone had a different opinion. But with the Arctic coast, this is in June, but by August, all this ice will be gone. So there'll be a lot of wave action hitting this permafrost. And that's what's happened in that brown area is the permafrost has melted, the waves have started eroding, and it's eroding into the ocean. So very different ecosystem situation than it was even 10 or 20 years ago. Next slide. And this is just one of our remote stations that we stayed at. Oops, it's time. I'm on my last slide. In Alaska, it was kind of cool because they have summer research stations set up. You stay in tents. They have bear fencing around it. When I was there, they left the bear fencing down because they said, "Oh, we haven't seen a bear in the last month, and there's enough people here." And then we took off in our helicopter to leave, and I saw this sow and her cub about 100 yards from the fence. So we radioed in and said, "You might want to turn your fence back on." But anyway, it just shows how vast. There are these runways and outposts, every 75 or 100 miles, but no roads, no other developments, just pretty untouched landscape. Next slide. Oh, and that's it. This is a last shot of the super bloom at the Carrizo Plain National Monument. This was one of my photos that went viral on the Department of the Interior site, and people were showing up at the Carrizo Plain Visitor Center a month later when everything was crisp and brown, and took it out on the visitor center staff that there weren't any wildflowers left. So again, accurate, complete information is important when we're getting info to visitors. But if anyone has any questions for me, I'll be glad to answer them now, but you can also feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call. And I've gone into freelance photography and been having some fun doing photos of both proposed conservation lands areas, as well as I've switched allegiance to the Forest Service a little bit too. I'm doing some work for them, but it's a lot of fun. I just urge you all to get out there and enjoy these places. All right, that's it.
Thank you, Bob. That was spectacular. I was mesmerized, and I could have had another hour of that. We do have time for a couple of questions, and thank you to those who put some in the chat that I'll get to. I do want to make a note to reinforce on the last couple of slides in terms of the campaigns that are priorities for the Conservation Lands Foundation. So we've got several dozen, but you've noted, 2 in the West and 1 in the Western Arctic, and we are currently fighting on all cylinders, a massive new oil drilling project that would be in the it's called the Willow Project in the Western Arctic that we are fighting, and so we invite anybody here who hasn't already weighed in to support our efforts to stop that, to do so. And then the other one on the Dolores River, we're really excited, as you noted, Bob. It's been a long time coming, and it's been decades of local collaboration, but with the help of one of our friends groups, the Dolores River Boating Advocates, just in the last 2 weeks, there was legislation introduced to protect it as a conservation area. So we're really excited at the progress we're making in Colorado for the Dolores River.
Great.
Yeah, so I'll go to, let's see, the first question here. I'll just go in order as we received it here. A question from Ron. He's enjoyed so much the availability of Creative Commons licensed photos from the BLM on the Flickr account. One of the things he's enjoyed is the ability to profile options for responsible travel and ecotourism in parks and protected areas. That said, most park departments are no longer documenting the parks via photos on Flickr. Can you address the trends you would like to see on social media when it comes to documenting conservation lands via digital photography? What are your recommendations?
That's a great question. I was really impressed at how BLM and the Department of Interior took off with social media during the Obama administration. And then unfortunately, things started going flat after that. And even during the Obama administration, we were in the promotion department. We were really pushing to highlight these various areas versus, not that we didn't do leave no trace and responsible use postings, but I saw during my last year, my career with the pandemic, there was so much more use on public lands that a lot of the agencies were working hard and scampering to try to get the word out there on social media and different aspects of publications and such to recreate responsibly. Unfortunately, budgets for social media programs, at least in BLM, have been cut recently, and they haven't had a full slate of employees. So if there's no one to do it, you'll see there's a lot less posts up now than there have been. It's just not going to get done. One thing I will say, though, is the government, maybe the Park Service is an exception, but government websites aren't the major way anymore that people get information about public lands. You go to Trails Illustrated, different OHV websites, hunting websites, fishing, that's where they're getting the information. So I think engaging with those groups, and a lot of times the agencies aren't able to engage as directly as you guys can as constituent groups. So call, these various entities and try to work with them to get the word out about responsible use and to try to quit over promoting areas that are getting over promoted, and to work with the agencies. Like when I worked at the King Range, I remember my first year there was no one on the Lost Coast Trail on the 4th of July. Now, 25 years later, the area's allocated. We have to limit the number of people that go in there, but you're ensured you're going to have a wilderness experience when you go there. It's not going to be overwhelmed with people. You might not get to go the day you want to go, but there's certain things that, unfortunately, with more people, have to put some limits in place.
Great, thank you, Bob. Another question around a campaign to designate additional wilderness study areas. Is that something that you're familiar
Yeah, I actually
with?
spent the last few years of my career doing this and putting on 2-day trainings. So let me do the 1-minute version. The BLM originally designated certain WSAs through our land use planning process, the resource management planning process. And during the Babbitt administration, the state of Utah sued the Bureau, saying that we no longer had authority to designate new wilderness study areas. So when Secretary Norton came in, the department settled with the state of Utah and said, okay, we're not going to designate additional WSAs. We don't have this authority, but we can still manage areas through our land use planning process to protect wilderness characteristics. So the issue is that's a court settlement. It's not, it wasn't decided by the Supreme Court or anyone else. It was just the department agreeing to do that. So, that's open for further negotiation. And I think that's been the push to ask Secretary Haaland to say, hey, we need, instead of this loosey-goosey wilderness characteristics, I don't want to say anything goes, because there's some important components of that protection, but let's get back to identifying additional wilderness study areas that were overlooked in these original studies.
Great. And then last question we have time for is, when you took the photo of Mono Lake from Bodie Mountain, did you spend the night up there?
I spent the night, I was actually up there about a month ago, and it was 36 degrees at sunset at about 9,000 feet. That photo's taken at about 10,000 feet. So it's pretty amazing. The Bodie Hills are a Great Basin ecosystem, but it's also alpine. I probably hiked in about an hour before sunset, hiked in about 3/4 of a mile and up about 1,000 feet. But no, I spent the night just below it. So.
Great. Well, that is our time. And so thank you, Bob, for being our field guy and To our guests, thank you for being here. And we hope that his brilliant photography, inspires you as much as it does us to support our mission. You can, I think Nicole put it
Can
in
I?
the chat. Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
I saw Elvin's thing, and Elvin Clapp's thing about Photoshop. And it's always a question that bothers me. And I use Lightroom, Elvin. Elvin's a good friend. But I also shoot raw photos, which are very flat photos when they come out of the camera. Most people who shoot from an iPhone or a point and shoot camera, their photo is photoshopped in the camera. There's all these algorithms that do that. By using Photoshop or Lightroom, you make the choice as the photographer to be your own digital darkroom. You're going to make the adjustments. So yeah, I do adjust contrast. I adjust white point and black point. Ansel Adams spent more time in the darkroom than he ever did taking photos. It's just unfortunate that we've gotten to the point where people are like, oh, this is what just came out of the camera. I didn't Photoshop it. It's like, no, the finesse is in the digital darkroom. It's just people have overdone it and overbaked photos and sort of add fake sky and everything else, and have kind of ruined the reputation of Photoshop as a tool that it really can be. So anyway, that's my soapbox on that.
Yeah, that's our behind the scenes, look. And I love the other tip you gave about getting a child to smile by running. And I bet that just goes for all of us if we were running in the backcountry.
Yeah, that's true.
I love that. So if you want to you can find more of Bob's photography on Instagram. He's at Wick Photos on Instagram. And also a reminder for, all of our supporters and those who maybe aren't yet, it's your financial support that strengthens our Friends Grassroots Network, who are the relentless advocates for these places. Conservation Lands Foundation, we're celebrating our 15th anniversary, and we invite you to support our mission at whatever level works for you. And you can do that through the donate link that has been put in the chat and also on our website. So this is the second of 3 in a series that we have of our community conversations, focusing specifically on photographers and artists that focus on the National Conservation Lands. And so the third one, mark your calendars, September 15th at 3:30 Mountain Time. We will have the pleasure of hosting and featuring Chekel Salgado and Michaela Whitmore, and they're the featured artists in the Spirit of the Land exhibit, which is promoting the designation of a Aviquame National Monument in Nevada, and one of our priority campaigns at CLF. So thank you again, and thank you, Bob. Thanks everyone for being here, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.